Welcome to Spirit Light Journey. Today we explore, is prayer magic or science? The Spiritist truth.
Usually when you hear people talk about prayer, it's treated as this profound mystery. You fold your hands, you send some words out into the void, and you just sort of hope someone, somewhere, is listening.
Right. It's built entirely on faith. It's
Yeah.
treated as this ethereal, completely intangible thing.
Exactly. But if you look at the 19th century texts of Allan Kardec's Spiritism, that void is not empty at all. In fact, it's a highly mechanical physical network. Welcome to today's deep dive for Wednesday, March 18th, 2026.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are opening up a really fascinating stack of sources for you. We're diving into Kardec's original foundational texts alongside some modern scholarly analyses of his work to explore this shockingly rational, physics-based perspective on prayer.
Yeah, it really flips the whole concept on its head.
It really does. Whether you consider yourself spiritual, a history buff, or you're just, insanely curious about how past thinkers tried to map the unknown, this deep dive is going to completely reframe how you look at the mechanics of faith. Because in these texts, prayer isn't magic. It's a literal, physical link between worlds. It's an act of worship governed by strict natural laws.
Yeah, and to really grasp the mechanics of this, we need to bypass those typical Victorian seance tropes you're probably already familiar with.
Oh, for sure, the parlor tricks.
Right, the 19th century was full of parlor tricks, table turning, fraudulent mediums, all of that. But Allan Kardec, who was actually an educator with a background in science, wasn't interested in any of that. He was trying to build a comprehensive physics model for the soul.
Because of the cultural climate at the time, right?
Exactly. He stepped into a mid-19th century France that was just deeply polarized. On one hand, you had this strict dogmas of the Catholic Church, and on the other, this rising tide of atheistic materialism.
So people were basically choosing between blind faith and cold, hard science.
Yeah, for many intellectuals at the time, science was explaining the physical world so well that there just seemed to be no room left for the spirit. Kardec's mission was to bridge that gap by arguing that the supernatural simply does not exist.
Wait, no supernatural at all?
None. Everything, including spirits, is part of nature. They're just governed by laws we simply haven't mapped yet.
Which means he had to define the actual environment where matter and spirit interact. I mean, if prayer isn't magic, it has to have a medium to travel through. The sources talk extensively about something Kardec called the universal fluid. How does this fluid actually function in his model?
So Spiritism posits that what we perceive as empty space is actually permeated by this universal primitive fluid. It serves as the intermediary substance between raw physical matter and pure immaterial spirit.
Like an atmosphere.
Exactly. Think of it as the atmosphere of the spiritual world. Just as sound requires air molecules to compress and transmit a physical voice, thought requires this universal fluid to transmit from one intelligence to another.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Kardec borrowed heavily from his earlier career studying animal magnetism or mesmerism, right?
He did, yeah. In mesmerism, the belief was that the human will could literally polarize this invisible fluid.
Let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. Polarizing it like running a magnet over iron filings to force them into a specific pattern.
That is the exact mechanism. When Kardec applied this magnetic theory to the soul, he argued that your focused thought acts as the magnet. It manipulates the universal fluid.
Oh, wow.
So when you think a thought or when you pray, you aren't just having an internal psychological experience. You are actively vibrating this fluid and creating a targeted magnetic current.
I'm curious how modern scholarship looks at this today, because on one hand, it sounds like he's predicting the invisible frequencies we use now, but on the other hand, it's deeply tied to discredited 19th century pseudoscience like mesmerism. When sociologists or historians analyze this universal fluid today, what do they see?
Modern scholarly analyses generally view his work through two distinct lenses. From a history of science perspective, scholars note that Kardec was heavily influenced by the contemporary discoveries of electromagnetism.
Right, he was living through the invention of the telegraph.
Exactly. He was watching the mapping of magnetic fields, and he logically applied those emerging invisible physical laws to theology. Some modern physicists and sympathetic academics even draw these loose conceptual parallels between his universal fluid and early field theory, or quantum entanglement.
The idea that invisible networks connect seemingly separate entities.
Right. But sociologically, scholars argue this was a brilliant, necessary coping mechanism for the 1850s. It provided an intellectual class people who were terrified of the existential void of atheistic materialism, a highly systemic, rational way to keep the soul alive without abandoning the scientific method.
The sources literally quote Kardec's communicators calling this fluid a universal telegraph line connecting all worlds. If we update that metaphor for you listening today, it operates exactly like a modern Wi-Fi network.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
We can't see the Wi-Fi signals bouncing around the room, but our devices are constantly broadcasting and receiving data packets through that invisible medium.
And in this system, your spirit is the device. It's constantly online. But a spirit, being pure intelligence, needs hardware to interface with this network.
Enter the perispirit.
Exactly. This is where Kardec introduces the perispirit, which is the semi-material envelope encasing the soul, drawn directly from that universal fluid.
So it's the antenna.
Yes. When you pray, your will mobilizes the fluid, and your perispirit acts as the antenna, directing a magnetic broadcast straight to the recipient.
But wait, if the intent is the only thing that polarizes the fluid and crosses over, that raises a massive question about the spoken word. Because if I say a prayer out loud, the physical sound waves are just vibrating the oxygen in the room. They aren't interacting with the spiritual Wi-Fi network at all.
The vocal cords do absolutely no heavy lifting in Spiritism. The physical sound of the words is entirely irrelevant to the transmission.
So the words literally do not matter.
Only the raw emotional intention and the focused will cross over into the universal fluid. The physical sound just stops in the air.
The texts are incredibly harsh about this, actually. They heavily critique, wrote, memorized formulas, and paid prayers. They argue that if you're just murmuring words you memorized or, paying a priest to say a prayer for you, but your heart isn't actively engaged in the intention, the signal completely drops. You are broadcasting dead air.
What's fascinating here is how fundamentally that democratizes the concept of spirituality. The texts explicitly state that high-order spirits and God are not touched by the prayers of the vain or the proud, no matter how eloquent the language is.
So eloquence is useless without intent.
Completely useless. A totally uneducated person who can't articulate their feelings into a coherent sentence, but who possesses a pure, desperate, loving intent, broadcasts a massively louder signal than a highly educated scholar who's just reading a perfectly crafted script without real feeling. The emotional intent is the voltage.
I have to push back on that, though. If the words truly do not matter at all, why do humans instinctively rely on formal, scripted prayers? I mean, why do every major religion and culture build these massive, elaborate books of liturgy? If it doesn't help the broadcast, is it just a psychological crutch?
It's a tool for focus. Think of a scripted prayer as the tuning dial on a radio.
Okay, I like that.
The dial itself doesn't generate the music, right? It simply helps you align with the correct frequency. For many people, a beautiful, familiar formula helps quiet their scattered mind and generate that sincere, concentrated emotion needed to broadcast a strong signal.
So it gets them in the zone.
Exactly. The danger, according to Spiritism, is mistaking the dial for the music itself. If you are reciting a beautiful liturgy, but your internal monologue is planning your grocery list.
The network registers the grocery list.
Precisely. The spiritual network registers the grocery list.
Okay, let's follow that causality then. Let's say you tune the dial perfectly. You broadcast this pure, intentional, high-voltage signal. What does that signal actually accomplish for you in the physical world? Because here's where it gets really interesting. Spiritism completely rejects the magic wand concept of prayer.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is not going to magically erase your problems or alter the fundamental designs of the universe.
Right. So what does it do?
This is where Kardec's systemic logic is most rigid. In Spiritism, the earth is defined essentially as a school. It's an environment specifically designed for expiation and trials. Your soul reincarnated here to face specific challenges that will force you to evolve morally and intellectually.
Wait, I need to challenge the underlying empathy of that logic. If I'm suffering from a terrible illness or facing absolute financial ruin, and Spiritism says I'm supposed to be suffering because Earth is a school for trials and therefore God won't cure my illness if I pray, that sounds incredibly bleak. It borders on cruel.
It can certainly sound harsh from a purely material perspective, which is exactly why Kardec wrote so extensively to reframe the view of a human lifespan.
How so?
Well, Spiritism argues that an 80-year lifespan is just a fraction of a second in the eternal evolution of your soul. Removing the trial would be like a teacher taking a final exam for their student.
Ah, I see.
The student avoids the stress of the test, but they learn absolutely nothing and fail to advance to the next grade. Prayer has no effect in changing the fundamental designs of those necessary trials.
But it must do something, right?
It does something incredibly practical within the bounds of those rules. A sincere prayer attracts what the texts call good spirits.
And these spirits intervene, but without breaking the rules of the school.
Exactly. They don't remove the obstacle, but they provide you with the moral strength, the courage, and the ideas to endure it and overcome it yourself.
It's like having a spotter at the gym. You're on the bench press and you have 200 pounds on the bar. That heavy barbell is your earthly trial, and you need the resistance of pushing that weight to build muscle, which is your spiritual progress.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Right. So if you pray, the spotter, the good spirit, isn't going to yank the barbell out of your hands and put it back on the rack, because then you don't build any muscle. But they stand right over you. They might put 2 fingers under the bar to help you stabilize. Their presence gives you the safety and the moral strength to push through the resistance yourself.
That analogy aligns perfectly with the mechanics described in the text. The sources note that God often answers prayers by simply suggesting the natural thought needed for a person to get themselves out of their predicament.
So heaven helps those who help themselves.
Exactly. You pray, your magnetic signal attracts an elevated intelligence, and that intelligence beams a solution or a comforting thought directly into your perispirit. You suddenly have a lucky idea, or you feel a wave of unexpected resilience.
Which leaves the responsibility squarely on your shoulders.
Yes, and it prevents that crisis of faith that occurs when people pray for a physical miracle and nothing physical changes. Spiritism tells you to check your internal reality instead. Did you find the strength to endure?
Okay, so if prayer gives the living the strength to push the barbell, what does it do for someone who doesn't have a physical body anymore? Because in these texts, the most profound function of prayer seems to be outward, acting as a lifeline directed at deceased, suffering spirits.
This is a cornerstone of the doctrine, and it relies heavily on those mechanics we discussed earlier. Remember, the dead still have their perispirit.
Right, the hardware.
Yes. And if a person was deeply materialistic, selfish, or committed terrible acts during their life, the universal fluid making up their perispirit becomes incredibly dense and heavy. They find themselves in a state of profound darkness, isolation, or torment, weighed down by the immediate consequences of their own moral state.
How does a prayer from the living actually intervene in that? You mentioned earlier that prayer causes a rapid disaggregation of their perispiritual fluid. What is the actual mechanism there?
Think back to the iron filings analogy. Their guilt and materialism make their perispirit dense, clumping the fluid together with a heavy negative charge.
Okay.
When you, the living, direct a sincere, loving prayer to one of these suffering spirits, your high-frequency intent acts as an opposing magnetic force. It hits that dense fluid and agitates it. It's a literal transfer of energy that breaks down the structural integrity of those heavy clumps.
So it physically lightens them up.
It physically lightens their load, making it easier for them to detach from their earthly suffering and begin to look upward. And alongside that mechanical relief, there is immense moral consolation. In an ocean of isolation, they receive a direct beam of empathy, realizing they are not forgotten.
But the sources also contain transcripts of supposedly channeled conversations with some truly hardened, cynical characters. I mean, murderers and cruel spirits who actively mock the people praying for them. So, what does this all mean for them? Does the signal just bounce off? Or can you forcefully disaggregate their fluid against their will?
This raises an important question about the absolute rule of free will in Spiritist doctrine. You cannot forcefully save a spirit. God does not magically flip a switch to make a bad spirit good. The spirit itself must initiate repentance. And the texts are very clear that repentance is not just saying, I'm sorry because the environment is painful.
Right, it's not just regret over being caught or punished.
Precisely. True repentance in this framework is a fundamental, sorrowful realization of the evil committed, followed by an ardent desire to make reparations.
Which usually involves coming back.
Yeah, usually this means the spirit will eventually ask for a new incarnation, a new physical life, specifically designed to test them in the areas where they failed, or to allow them to serve the very people that previously harmed. Until they reach that point of genuine repentance, their dense, resistant mindset blocks the immediate relief of your prayer.
So if they mock it, if they're stubbornly sitting in their pride, mocking the transmission, the prayer fails.
The immediate relief is delayed. But Kardec's communicators heavily emphasize that prayers for hardened spirits are never wasted.
Really? Even if they reject it?
Even if the spirit rejects the signal in the moment, that loving intention plants beneficial magnetic seeds in their perispirit. It alters their spiritual environment just a tiny bit. Over time, their pride will eventually exhaust itself, because evil is considered a dead end in this system, and every intelligence eventually tires of suffering.
So it's a waiting game.
Exactly. When they finally break, those accumulated seeds of prayer will be there, predisposing them to choose the good. The system respects their free will entirely, but the mechanics ensure that no one is eternally damned.
That is just a staggering way to view the universe. It creates
Right.
this active, rational, empathetic network where nobody is permanently lost. Every single thought is framed as a physical force that either drags the network down or lifts it up.
It really is a beautiful system when you look at the mechanics of it.
It is. And for you listening, seeing historical beliefs through this highly systemic, logical lens bridges the gap between science and spirituality in a truly unique way. It takes the mystical act of prayer and turns it into applied physics, psychology, and sociology all rolled into one.
Yeah, it forces us to reconsider what we're putting out there.
Exactly. It tells you that your mind is a transmitter of tangible power, which forces us to ask what exactly we are broadcasting. Because if the spoken words are secondary and the intent is the only thing that moves the needle, it completely redefines what constitutes a prayer.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it leads us to one final striking concept from the source material. If true prayer is just the transmission of pure, helpful, loving intent that lightens the load of another, then it doesn't have to be a thought at all. Action is the ultimate prayer.
Action.
Yes. The text literally states giving to those who suffer. That is prayer. It argues that the humble homespun garment is much closer to the gold-stitched robe than one might suppose. It challenges us to ponder that replacing spoken words with actual physical charity might be the most powerful, high-voltage broadcast a human being can possibly make on that universal network.
So the ultimate broadcast on this network might not be a thought at all, but handing someone a coat, stepping in as the spotter for someone else's heavy barbell. Something to think about the next time you log on to the network. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.